So, as I said, I wanted to talk about generosity today. I worked out a plan for 3 sermons on generosity that was going to increase our giving about 800% in this church. And people were just going to pour out money, and we were going to fix everything that needed fixing, and we're going to live into our vision of who it is we aspire to be, all with God's blessings and all the money we need. However, my plans are subject to change. And God's Spirit kept at me about 2 kinds of violence. One, mass shootings or gun violence, and also domestic violence. And thus, the title of my sermon, Guns and God, the Prevailing Wisdom. So let's begin with mass shootings. Mass shootings are defined as shootings in which 4 or more people are killed or wounded. You'll remember that 3 years ago, this December 16th, we held a vigil in which we prayed and lit luminaries for the victims of the Newtown shooting. 20 children and 6 adults. I remember that night vigil going out into the lobby there, and we had assembled a couple of us luminaries, all with paper bags and sand and candles, and we had written before we filled them up names of each victim. I remember with mixed emotions lighting the bag with Adam Lanza's name on it, lighting a luminary and praying for his family as well. But we did. This past Tuesday night at Socrates Cafe, which is something I do on the first Tuesday of the month, and some of you that I see here attend that as well, we gather and we talk about things. We discuss usually a very important question and come out with absolutely no answers. But about 25 of us gathered and talked for 2 hours about guns and gun control. One person, a retired school teacher, shook his head as he said, "You know, I thought after Sandy Hook we would do something about this." He said, "But here we are almost 3 years later, and if we didn't do anything about it then, we're never going to do anything about it." He was hopeless about it. I find myself feeling hopeless about it as well. Maybe you do too. I understand his hopelessness and where it comes from, I think. Because just the sheer number of mass shootings since Newtown, Connecticut in 2012, December 2012. So let me ask, I'm going to throw out a number and ask you a question. Would 298 mass shootings since then be enough for us to do something about that? No? There have been 298 mass shootings since January 1st, 2015. You can add to that 364 and 337 respectively for 2013 and 14 since Sandy Hook. More than 1,000 mass shootings since Sandy Hook. How many of those have you heard about? Probably not 1,000, even if you watch Fox News religiously. Overall, crime is on the decrease, I'm told, but mass shootings are on the increase. So I can understand my friend's helplessness about this, and I can understand it also because of the prevailing notion in this country that it's a God-given right to own a gun. We live in a culture, it's a culture of gun ownership. This is a cultural phenomenon. We glorify guns. We hold them sacred. Why else, other than holiness, would 8 in 10 conservative pastors believe that gun ownership protects people from being the victims of a crime? 80% of conservative pastors believe that. Even though having a gun in the home dramatically increases the likelihood of gun deaths, especially among women living with an abusive domestic partner, who is 500 times more likely in the next abusive incident to be shot and killed by that abuser with that gun. So, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you own a gun. I don't have to. We're predominantly white, progressive, mainline Christian church, and 54% of us sitting in this room own guns. 54% of us. If we were a predominantly white, so-called evangelical gathering of church people, 58% of us would own guns. Not much better. So I'm not going to ask you about that. And you might assume that since I'm preaching a sermon about guns and gun control and gods, that I don't own a gun. You'd be wrong. So let me tell you a story about the gun I own. Some years ago, when I was in between seminary and what I was actually going to do with my life, I paused for about 3 years and worked as a credit sales manager at a tire store in Siler City. Among other things, we also sold, we sold tires, but we also sold appliances. And occasionally I'd be called upon to accompany one of the delivery men on a delivery of appliances. And one day I was called to go on such a delivery of a refrigerator to a woman of some considerable age, very near where I grew up, where my mom and dad's house still stands, about half a mile if you walk through the cow pastures behind the house. And we pulled up, we uncarted the new refrigerator on the back of the truck, pulled it off the truck, took it inside the house, rolled it in, set it aside, pulled out the old refrigerator. And as we did so, I noticed behind the old refrigerator, stuck in the crevice in the very corner between the wall and the refrigerator, a double-barrel .410 shotgun. Not uncommon. We probably had those around my house, stuck in the same place. I reached over to it and I took it and I handed it to the woman and I said, "What do you want to do with this?" And I'll never forget her reply. She said, "You might as well take it with you. My sons will just fight over it." At first, I imagined her sons fighting over it, taking the form of friendly family banter about an heirloom passed down from a grandfather to a grandson. And who would be the son who next held that sacred trust and passed it down to their son. Supporting evidence of our veneration of guns. Nothing inherently violent about that, though. But when I listened to the story her eyes were telling, I realized that her imagined version of the story she was telling was quite different about what would happen with that gun. Because maybe she had already been threatened by that gun, maybe more than once. Maybe she herself was a victim of domestic violence. Maybe she knew innately from personal experience and from the stories of friends that a woman living in a house with an abuser and a gun is 500 more times likely to die by that gun point in the next abusive incident. And that 38% of those homicides include the shooting death of other children and family members or bystanders. Maybe she knew that. If I'd made that delivery this year in 2015, then maybe she'd know that more than half of all mass shootings also include the death of an intimate partner or family member. And maybe she would know then as now that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And that in the month of October alone, 5 women will be killed with guns every day. And of those 155 women killed with guns in the month of October, more than half of them will be killed by a domestic partner. So I understand my friends expressed hopelessness this past Tuesday night in the wake of yet another mass killing. And yet the prevailing wisdom, even among Christians, seems to be that gun ownership is a God-given command. The prevailing wisdom is that more guns make life safer. What did we do after Newtown? What did we do? We listened to the NRA and we armed more people. We said more guns make people more safe. We started insisting teachers get gun training, even though the historical record testifies that more guns mean more, not fewer, deaths by guns. Am I missing something here? I mean, I'm really starting to question my sanity about this because of the way I feel about it. Am I completely clueless? More guns make us safer? I don't get that. I'm sorry. How many gun deaths occur when there's no gun present? Anybody? I'm not a statistician. I'm not a historian. I'm not even a half-decent theologian, frankly. But it doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure that out. More guns means more deaths by guns. We aren't talking military here, Ebony, are we? We're talking about individuals in homes owning guns. You know what I found most interesting, though, about our discussion this past Tuesday night, our 2-hour discussion on guns? What I found interesting was we talked about what the NRA thinks, and we talked about the Second Amendment. We talked about liberty, and we talked about fear. We talked about rights. We talked about the myth of liberty, that liberty with guns is the same as freedom in Christ. But I don't remember anyone asking, what might God say about this? I suppose that says more about me as the preacher sitting there than it does anything else. But what about God? Does God get a say in this argument? Yesterday I asked Tanner and Bryson in our confirmation meeting, what do you think? Where would Jesus be on this? You think Jesus would care? Really? Other than being some sort of, comical caricature? I can't imagine that. I have a hard time imagining that, particularly when it's Jesus who says, when he's being arrested by the Roman guards, he says to Peter, Peter, sheath your sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Do you not think I can appeal to my Father in heaven, and he'll send legions of angels to rescue me? Nevertheless, how would the Scriptures be fulfilled? It must be so. And then he reaches up and he heals the ear of the soldier Peter has just sliced with his sword. Debbie, will you come up and read our Ecclesiastes passage? In the story of this, did you even advance that screen one at least, and maybe one more to the scripture reading? Well, one more to the scripture reading. I just read to you the Matthew 26 passage there, 26:52 through 54, what Jesus says to Peter. And in that passage, you could easily insert the word gun where it says sword, because that was their lethal weapon at the time. But biblical wisdom gives us a different story about this too. So Debbie, if you'll read the Ecclesiastes passage.
This is from Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verses 13 through 18. I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building a great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor, wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard. The words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good.
Thank you, Debbie. Find it interesting that this wise man delivered the city. Poor wise man. But no one remembered him. It's like wisdom has been left out of the argument or forgotten. And yet wisdom is better. Of course, these are not the only verses on weapons of violence and death in the Bible, but from a Christian faith perspective, we are about giving and not killing. We're about living and not dying. Abundant life and living we talk about as Jesus talked about coming to bring. And I can't imagine that whatever leads a person to purchase a gun, whether it's fear or fascination or the illusion of power or glorification, whatever it is that leads a person to purchase a gun, I can't imagine has very much at all to do with the faith of the Christ of Christian Scripture or the Bible's God of love and justice. In another place, the Lord says, "Vengeance is mine." And unless we think we should replace God as arbiters of vengeance, then we're going to have to look to God to show us what is right here, and not our guns. So what are we to do? What are we to do? How are we called to act regarding God and our guns? Well, I think the first step is to talk about it, which is one reason you're hearing this sermon today. Another important thing is to do a little research. That was a simple internet search. Sojourners.net. I think it's sojo.net, S-O-J-O.net. Jim Wallace, who is the editor of Sojourners magazine, which is predominantly online now, has tons of statistics on mass shootings. He is actually also going to be on Talk of the Nation today at 5 on NPR. Jim Wallace, W-A-L-L-I-S, who's a Christian minister. Be informed. I mean, just, get your information about this is the first step. And then, let's agree to have some conversations about it. I recognize I have blind spots around this. I grew up in a house where there were guns. And this sermon, preparation for this sermon, I had to start reflecting on what my relationship was with those growing up. And I realized that I had completely put out of my mind my family's own horrible history, accidental history with guns. And I learned gun safety from my older brother, who had been a part of a gun accident. Didn't end in death, and I'm glad for that. But I realized just by starting to remember guns growing up and what that was like in my family, that there was some stuff I needed to deal with about that. My guess is you may also find that experience to be true for you. Begin a conversation, sensible conversations about guns. You may be interested to know that most, or at least more than half the members of the NRA are for tighter gun control and background checks for every gun purchase. But guess what? It's not the members of the NRA who are giving the money that drive the lobbyists who keep the legislation from being passed about gun control. So follow the money. Find out where the money's coming from. And that'll give you some insight about how the NRA's, less than half the NRA's funding comes from member dues. A lot of their funding that they use for lobbying comes from other sources. Jim Wallace calls that blood money of gun runners. You see, if we start restricting access, gun manufacturers lose a lot of money. So it really isn't about guns and God. It's really about money for innocent people. So follow the money. For now, let's follow Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And we'll find others by doing that. We'll find other more just ways to approach this trouble. But we can't sit back as people of faith and pretend it doesn't exist and not begin some conversation. We can't be responsible and not begin some conversations about it. So, what am I to do about this gun I own, which sits in a closet under the steps of my house, probably with a box of shells beside of it? It's a decent hunting gun. I suppose I could keep it and justify keeping it on that basis, and yet I have to recognize its presence in my home means there's a much greater possibility that I or someone I love, worse, could die from it, on purpose, accidentally, or otherwise. That's a reality. What are we to do about the guns? And whose wisdom will we follow? Amen.